Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Talk Show. I'm RJ Sheedy. Joining us today is Bob Massie, who is running for governor of Massachusetts as a Democrat. Bob, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us here today.
RJ, thank you so much.
So, you have a wonderful life. You have an amazing bio attached to you.
Yeah.
You have been a minister, a professor, an environmentalist, and you recently headed up the Sustainability Solutions Lab at UMass Boston.
Right.
Tell me more about your life before you started running for governor.
Well, I'll tell you, my life was very much affected that when I was born, I had a serious illness called hemophilia that causes some swelling in your joints. So, I came from a modest background and we had faced these medical challenges, and I have to say, a lot of insurance companies didn't want to cover us. I couldn't walk for a while. So, those were my struggle as a child. But what it did, it made me aware that sometimes people really need to rely on government or other systems to help them. And so that's one of the reasons I got into the race, is to help working families who are struggling to pay their rent or be able to afford a mortgage or get health insurance, which I was denied when I was younger. My health is fine now, but that memory sort of drove me into being interested in economic justice, social justice, and economic development. And I've spent most of my life doing that, plus the environmental work.
So when you were a child, is this true? You spent some time living in France with your parents?
My parents were writers. They were journalists. My mother's originally from Switzerland, and so they got the opportunity to go to France. And I was 12 at the time. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was so surprising is that the French have a commitment to healthcare as a right, and they were willing to cover me even though I was a foreign resident. And so I must say, I owe my ability to walk today to a country that had that commitment, and we don't have that yet in the United States. We still have too many people who don't have adequate health insurance. It costs too much, it doesn't cover them. And this, again, is especially true for working families who, depending on who their employer is, may or may not have decent insurance. That's why I'm supporting Medicare for all, making sure that we make quality health care available to everybody.
So I'm sure you'll be able to expand on that position a little bit more
Sure.
to viewers who might think that's a scary socialist idea kind of thing.
Oh, no.
But
It's, first of all, so many other countries, in fact, every other big country, industrial country, has a system of national health insurance. Some of it's run through private companies. The point is that we don't, in our country, we allow too many companies to bump people off who actually need health care. And instead, we need to help small businesses. We need to help folks who don't want to pay all those premiums. So we're ready to move, and I think most Americans realize that now.
living in France as a child, how did that impact your worldview, and how will that help you when it comes to potentially governing Massachusetts?
Well, it's a really good question, RJ. I think that one of the challenges we face in Massachusetts is that we're doing a lot of things right, but we aren't really aware of what's happening around the world, what's happening in other economies. I'll give you an example. Most other economies around the world are moving rapidly to renewable energy. Why? Because fossil fuel is expensive and dangerous and is harming our planet and also harming our local communities. So one of the things I would bring as governor is this awareness and experience with other countries that have been moving forward rapidly. Unfortunately, our governor has not been willing to lower people's energy bills or to take on the utilities that I think are taking advantage of us.
So let's talk about the governor for a little bit, and maybe about you. Why
Yeah.
do you want to be the next governor of Massachusetts?
Well, first of all, as I've traveled to more than 300 communities, I've seen that even though we're supposedly in a boom time, which is certainly true in Boston, but much of the rest of the state is still really struggling. And as I said, people are having trouble affording housing, being able to get insurance, or finding a decent job. And I know these problems affect this area as well, but we need a governor who really focuses on economic development. Also, to be prosperous in 10 years, we have to get busy on some big projects today. We don't have an adequate statewide transportation system. Our educational system is broken, whether it's K through 12 or our higher education system. And as I said, I want to move us toward renewable energy and other things that save us money in the long term. So this governor really is focusing on not spending any money. That may sound like a good idea until you realize that if you don't invest in infrastructure and roads and bridges and the system that lets business thrive, then we're not going to be able to prosper and we're not going to be able to compete. So I think that I bring that perspective of looking into the future and being able to design the programs and things that we need. I've done that in every job I've ever done, including at a very big, even national or international scale. And I think that's the kind of thinking we need today.
So let's talk about Governor Baker for a second.
Sure.
For some reason, polls show him as the most popular governor in America. He's not Trump. That's what his critics would tell him. However, a lot of people will say that it's not what he does that's a problem. It's what he doesn't do and what he doesn't say. Do you agree with that assessment? And what are the things that you maybe would want to see him take more of a stance on?
Well, I mean, I completely agree with that. You know, the governor, when you're governor, one of the things you should be doing is representing the values of the people that are your constituents. And unfortunately, it's true that Governor Baker seems like a perfectly nice guy, but the reality is that when people have come out against some of Trump's policies, when we've had you know, women's march and climate march and a gun violence march, the governor hasn't shown up. He hasn't made a statement. I think he's when Vice President Pence came along, he didn't want to be seen with the vice president of his own party. So I just have to say he's someone who has not stood up for our values, and he has been moving very slowly. I mean, just this year, in his 4th year of being governor, he has started to take on some of these challenges. I like to think it's because the Democratic candidates are pushing him. But honestly, I think we can't afford 4 more years of sort of baby steps. I've referred to him as Baby Steps Baker because he just doesn't take on those big projects that we need.
So you mentioned that he doesn't take a stance on things. He doesn't appear at rallies. He doesn't stand up for causes such as that. In his defense, is it the governor's job to be at these rallies? Why should the governor make time to go to these events?
Well, first of all, let me go back quickly to the point about his popularity. This number that comes out every month is put together by a Republican consulting firm, polling firm called Morning Consult, and they take the opinions. They say, do you think he's doing a very good job or a somewhat good job? And they put those together. So if you add everybody who thinks he's doing a somewhat good job, you get a higher number. But if you break that down, if you say, how's he doing on education, on opioids, on job creation, on transportation, on housing, he actually scores barely 35 or sometimes even 40%. That shows that people have the impression that he's doing something, but it's not true. And so that's part of a debate in a political campaign is to ask people, do you feel your life is really going better than 4 years ago? Do you feel confident that he will tackle those problems in the future? And I think people, when they ask themselves that question, they would rather have an active governor who does represent the values. So my answer to your question is yes, the governor should be out there, not every rally, not everything, but we have a president who's attacking the Constitution, undermining the United States itself. This is, you know, Charlie Baker is in the same party as Donald Trump and probably will vote for Donald Trump, is raising money for Donald Trump. So I think the voters of Massachusetts have to take a very clear look at him and decide, is that what they want for the next 4 years?
So before, I want to bring us back to reality because I would love to just talk to you about running against Charlie Baker.
Yeah.
But you still have one more hurdle before you can go head to head with him.
Yeah.
Before you can go head to head with him, you have to win the primary nomination on September 4th and beat Jay Gonzalez for that nomination. He was selected at the convention as the endorsed candidate by the Democratic Party. Why do you think you're the better candidate to go head to head against Charlie Baker?
Well, I mean, frankly, Jay's a perfectly nice guy, but he is the establishment candidate. He's someone who has worked the system. He's worked with his friends in Beacon Hill, and I don't really object to that. I mean, that's what you do in politics. But the problem is there's a Beacon Hill perspective, an insider perspective, that influences what you think can be done. I'm someone from the outside. I've led big organizations, I mentioned at the national level. I've brought people together across very large differences. We've designed things that move forward in the future, and I think what we need is a bold, progressive visionary. And Jay will say that he's a progressive, but a progressive really tackles economic injustice, is willing to invest in working families, and I believe I have exactly that kind of experience of making deep change. I think that when people look at us, they'll see that we also have different personalities, different life experience, different visions for the future in some cases. And so really it comes down to what kind of leader do people want. I'm going to be somebody who comes out into the community. I've said that I will move the governor's office 2 days a month to some other part of the state, and I'd be happy to come here in the early stage of my administration.
You'll have your governor's office right here in the studio?
Well, let's see. Maybe we have to find some place in this area. But you know, I've been repeatedly to this part of the state, and I understand some of the problems that all of you are facing with education and with water contamination, those other issues. And I want to bring the governor's office right here so that the attention is focused here on the strengths of this community and the challenges that need to be addressed.
So before we get back to the issues, I do want to talk about this new wave of progressive challengers that we're seeing challenge the political establishment throughout the nation. We just saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez take down Joe Crowley in New York. Alana Presley is looking to unseat Mike Capuano here in Massachusetts. You said you identify as yourself as a progressive. What does it mean to be a progressive here in Massachusetts, in your mind?
First of all, it's a term that people have been using partly because the term liberal has faded away. But progressive has a strong tradition. We had a progressive era. And that meant when working people and farmers and unions, by the way, I'm a union member, took on the big powers, the big corporations, the big industries that were controlling our Congress and were blocking important legislation. Here's the interesting thing. Even our Republican president at that time, Theodore Roosevelt, backed the progressive movement. So, and I think we're in the same time. We have dark money, big corporations, billionaires controlling much of the country now at the federal level, and so the battle has moved to the states, and we see some of our industries, big pharma, big banks, big oil, big utilities, slowing down the kind of legislation that we need to really help people who are in the middle class or struggling to get into the middle class. We don't have that right now. So to be a progressive means that you're willing to take on economic injustice, that you're willing, in some cases, to take on big multinational companies, you're willing to take on the Beacon Hill traditions that need to be changed. And it means fighting for change. And I think that's something, I have a 40-year record of doing that, and I think that distinguishes me from other people in the race.
So let's talk about the issues now. We talked plenty about you. We talked a lot about the race. I want to talk more about the issues and what drives your campaign now. You have a long 40-year life of experience. One of the things that you really dedicated a lot of your life to was climate change.
Right.
Why has this become seemingly one of your signature issues?
Well, first of all, climate change is very, very serious, and it's starting to have an impact on coastal Massachusetts, where we had 37 communities flood this winter. You saw a photograph of a kayaker going through this new seaport district in Boston. We see the wildfires out in California. We see changes that are taking place. Now, some of us identified this problem a long time ago, and I organized the very first big public meeting in Boston on climate change in 1992. And I have to tell you, I came out of that big gathering and I thought, my gosh, this is going to take 10 years for us to fix. And that was 26 years ago. So now, unfortunately, we've gone past the place where we can just stop it. We're now experiencing the effects of it, and people are finally waking up. Now, it's a danger, but it's also a huge opportunity. And this is something that I don't think that the governor has fully realized. We could lower people's energy bills and small business and towns' energy bills. We could generate an entirely new industry with tens of thousands of jobs. And if we built out a full renewable system, we could bring $6 billion of new revenue to the state. So this is a win-win-win, except the governor is still very much supporting fossil fuel and the utilities. So for me, I think it's something worth fighting about. And, you know, people, when asked, does climate affect you today in your life? The answer may be no. When they think about, is this something government should worry about and act on, they say yes. And I built my campaign on that in part because it's part of that looking into the future, being ready for what comes, and setting us up for prosperity. And right now, one of the threats to our prosperity is if we don't do anything about climate change.
So something has to be done. A new report just came out that shows that 2018 is going to be now the 4th hottest year on record, or something ridiculous like that. 2016, 2017, 2018, it's all just been hotter after the next.
Right.
What would you do as governor to make that difference?
Well, first of all, as I said, we need to make that transition to renewable energy. And it doesn't happen overnight.
So how do we wean ourselves off those fossil fuels?
There's a couple of things, and there's some very good proposals in the legislature, some of which unfortunately are going to die today because it's the last day of the legislative session. But as governor, I would push them through. So first of all, we actually have barriers to solar energy right now. We charge people if they go on solar, and there is a cap on how much solar we can have. That's ridiculous. I would remove those barriers to switching. We also should be developing our offshore wind. We should have done that 10 years ago. The governor has just made a very small move, but he wants to build big pipelines that tear up our community, that we don't need, and that really are just to make more profit for our utility investors. We have public utilities that say they've served the public. They really serve their investors on Wall Street. They want to push up profits and push up their own stock price. That's a mistake. I understand there's a business model that they have, but we need now to evolve. There's also the idea of a transition dividend where we give people money. We tax some carbon use, but we give people money so they can switch to better cars, to higher efficiency heating systems. Anyway, I don't want to wonk out on you. I'll just tell you that there are many countries around the world that are eagerly seizing this opportunity. We're kind of stuck in the mud and we don't even realize it. And I think that's wrong for the future of Massachusetts.
So something that you actually have done, you've kind of already done something about this. In May of 2014, you called on Harvard University to divest its endowment from fossil fuels.
Right.
I attend Worcester State. Every year, the students repeatedly ask its university president to divest from fossil fuels.
Right.
Why is it important for public institutions not to invest in fossil fuels like this?
Well, there's two reasons. One is that the the fossil fuel industry as a whole is going down and losing money. And so partly the students and others are pointing out this industry is dying. Let me give you an example. People continued, including our state, to invest in coal. Now, coal, Peabody Coal, was the biggest coal company in the world. Its shares were $1,000 a share. And yet it went down to 800, 600, 400, 200 because nobody's buying coal. People are dumping coal. And finally went to 152 and went bankrupt. So if the people had been listening to those students saying, watch out, this industry. And then in addition, there's a moral question. Do you want our major institutions to be receiving money from companies that have lied to the public, defrauded their own investors, or damaging the planet, and are blocking change? To me, I don't want to be associated with that. I don't want to receive money for it. Besides, I would lose money doing that. So I do believe that major institutions should divest, both for solid economic reasons and for moral reasons, and it does have an impact. I wrote a very long book a number of years ago about the way divestment affected the debate in South Africa, and it worked. I mean, people really had a huge impact. So this is a debate we need to have, and as governor, I would promote people dumping their fossil fuel stock because it's a sure path to losing money.
Okay, would you maybe promote that use through incentives, or how would you get these public institutions to actually do that? What pressure would you give them?
Well, it depends on the institution. In many cases,
let's take the college example, because you already called on Harvard to do that.
So there's two things. The first thing is that the trustees really have to understand what's at stake. And so, people who are responsible for the future of an institution, like any college, they're going to say, well, wait a minute, I don't want to get into selling stock if it jeopardizes our future. Well, the people don't really understand. They don't understand how poorly this industry has done. Our state pension system lost $500 million because of this. The second thing is they don't necessarily want to second guess the Wall Street people who are advising them. But I'll tell you something, I'm a social justice activist and a former minister who actually went to Harvard Business School. I understand just how broken the Wall Street system is. And so too many trustees just say, I'll do whatever they tell me on Wall Street. That's a mistake. So, explaining this to them often has the impact. If that doesn't work, then you start putting pressure on people, which you can do in a lot of different ways as governor, both inviting them and pushing them to make the right decision.
Would you maybe suggest for them to go towards more of a greener option if there seems to be more money there, which I feel like you're saying there is?
Absolutely. Look, we have done a poor job relative to other countries on this, making it possible for people to spend less on their energy bills. But we absolutely, as you see what's happening across the world. Let me give you an example. California just decided to require that every new home have solar power. Now think about that. That means that all the new homes that are built from now on are going to be relatively free. They're going to get energy from the sun. They're going to lower their energy bills. They're going to be more efficient. Why can't we do something like that in Massachusetts, phase that in over time? So there's many, many things you can do in government, whether it's at the municipal level or at the regional level or at the state level, but you need to have a governor who understands where the economy is going. And you need to have someone who is really committed to local families and local communities. And I think that's something I've spent my whole life doing.
Let's switch gears onto another issue now.
Sure.
Let's talk about immigration. Nationally, we're seeing an absolute mess unfold at our border. We just saw Charlie Baker recently send members of our National Guard down to help enforce Trump's policies.
Well, and then he reversed that when he realized it wasn't popular. So
good for him finally realizing that.
Well,
I
that's
guess.
kind of his pattern. He does something and then people object and then he backs up.
And then on the flip side, a little locally, my state senator Ryan Fatman introduced a bill that was competing against Jamie Eldridge's Safe Communities Act, where he basically wanted Massachusetts not to be a sanctuary state. What is your take with everything that's unfolding with immigration lately?
Well, first of all, I mean, we have to recognize that President Trump has exploited the fears and the concerns that people have about immigration in a very unfair and I would even say racist way. So he is taking problems that people are experiencing and saying you can blame your problems, your unemployment, whatever it is, on immigration. Now that's an old pattern in American history, but it is a dangerous pattern. Unless you are a descendant of Native Americans, every one of us is a descendant of immigrants. My father's family came over a long time ago. My mother, as I mentioned, came from Switzerland recently. So we are a nation of immigrants. We need to help particularly young dreamers, the people who came here as children, find a way to citizenship. And I believe that I share the view that many chiefs of police have that when you put this kind of unfair, damaging, cruel pressure on immigrants, you actually make public safety worse because they are more vulnerable to being exploited. They don't feel comfortable telling police about crime. And so I think that Senator Fatman is mistaken in this matter, that both in terms of our values as a nation, what we do economically and how much immigrants contribute, and what our public safety concerns are, I think that we should be moving forward on the Safe Communities Act. I would certainly promote it and I would sign it.
For the people who don't think that it's a good idea, what do you tell them? For the people who think that cops should be doing the job of federal agents, what do you tell to them?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I was just in this area. I was in at a Democratic Town Committee last week, and I heard the concerns from a number of people in this region about how we don't have the resources to be asking a limited police force to be taking on federal duties, and that is a burden that I gather, and I certainly share this view, that most communities in this region really do not want to take on.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
One last topic before we kind of start to wrap things up here today. It doesn't have much effect for us here in Metro West, but in the Boston communities, this is huge for them, the T. Riders can't depend on it. It's a mess. They are absolutely sick of it. It's a problem that's been consistent and it's being ignored for far too long. We need to figure out a way to move us to a modern transportation system here in the state.
Right.
What do we do? How do we fix this?
Well, the first thing
you
do.
Too late.
By the way, everywhere I go, including in Metro West, I've heard concerns about how difficult it is to get around the state. Just last night I was in Haverhill, north of Boston. They are 30 miles away, and the train takes 90 minutes to get to Boston. Imagine that. So that's completely ridiculous. What we need is a comprehensive statewide plan that lays out how we're going to not only deal with Boston, but deal with our north-south, our east-west, all of the things, deal with the bus service. Many lower-income people do not have cars. The only way they can get around is on buses, and yet this governor has been cutting bus service. So, the thing that's so ridiculous about this is not only is it so important for working families, it's also the key to the future. Japan has high-speed rail, Germany has high-speed rail, China has 12,000 miles of high-speed rail. Those trains go 160, 200 miles an hour. The United States has 0. 0. So, if you're in a game and the score is 12,000 to 0, who's ahead? So we need to, in Massachusetts, have a comprehensive plan that really helps all of our regions, connects all of our cities so that people can move forward. It would improve housing availability. It would improve our economies. It is part of planning for the future. That's something I know how to do, and I think we need to get busy doing it.
So I've heard the idea of the north-south rail before. Explain that more to people and more or less, I guess, give your pitch on it to them.
Well, North-South Rail Link is a very simple idea. We have a North Station, we have a South Station. They're not very far apart. But if you want to go, let's say, from the North Shore down to the Cape, how do you do that? You go down, you get out at North Station, you have to take a taxi or the T, you have to go to South Station, get on another train. It doesn't make any sense at all. And what that means is that all the activity from the north is blocked when it comes to Boston, all the activity from the south and so forth. So the North-South Rail Link is a kind of solution that's done all over the world all the time, which is to dig a tunnel between South Station and North Station so they can be connected. That is expensive, but the gains would be enormous. And unfortunately, this governor would rather invest in redoing South Station rather than connecting things. And unfortunately, also, he put out a study that said this was extremely expensive. We think that study is absolutely flawed and that you need to think ahead to connect those stations so that the economy actually works.
So here's a question. He's fixing up South Station. What's wrong with it?
I'm sorry? Well, partly because it's older and they want to expand it, but I think this is misplaced spending, because if you use that money to connect north and south, you wouldn't necessarily have to upgrade to South Station as much as they want to. There's also a big post office facility right there, so they want to do some redesigning. All of that makes some sense, but we have to put the priorities into making sure that people in the state with small businesses can get back and forth, or people can commute from one place to another, and the system is really absolutely broken. Our commuter time for people who drive to work, everybody knows it's going shooting up, and we have no plan. If we have no plan, at some point our highways are just going to become parking lots, and we can walk from car to car to get to work.
We're almost out of time today, Bob.
Okay.
Before we go, the floor is yours. You're looking to run against Charlie Baker, become governor of Massachusetts. When voters ask you, why do you want to be governor? What is your pitch to them? What is your last words for our audience?
Well, I'd like to just remind the audience that the way we build a future that works for ourselves, for our kids, for our grandkids, is that you have to think ahead, and you have to make those commitments to building a better Massachusetts. I believe that as someone who comes from working on social justice, economic justice questions, who has had real success working on economic issues, working with businesses, and who's someone who is actually, I think, well recognized for my ability to set us up for the future, I think that's what we need. If we have 4 more years of Charlie Baker, we're not going to move forward on single-payer health care. We're not going to move forward on transportation. We're not going to improve our affordable housing. We're not going to move to renewable energy. Each one of those things is critical, and so I understand that people are struggling. They don't have enough money. We need to bring those costs down, but we do that by building the economy and making sure that we have the ingredients for a prosperous future for everybody.
Bob Massie, thank you so much for joining us here on Talk Show today. And that's all the time that we have for us today on the special edition of Talk Show with RJ Sheedy. I do want to, of course, thank Bob Massie for being here. He is running for governor as a Democrat in the state. For more information about him, please visit his website, bobmassie2018.com.
September 4th.
September 4th, yes. Primary day in Massachusetts is September 4th, and the general election is on November 6th. As always, I encourage you to learn about everybody who is running so you can make a good, informed decision on who you should cast your vote for. That's it for us tonight. Good night, everybody.
Like Talk Show? Subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates on your favorite local TV host.